that question?
And then while David's coming up, Madam Chair, I could follow up with that would be, is what is South Salt Lake doing with their impact fees and their permit fees?
I'm not sure on that, but I can look into it and get back to you.
That would be important for me on a decision.
And we can ask Shelter the Homeless folks that question when they come up. David?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Councilmember Fowler, thank you for the question. I would say that it was anticipated that the request would be made as the discussion, and Councilmember Johnson also asked you to weigh in if at all in terms of the conversations with I can't remember the name of the committee that we put together, the city, county, South Salt Lake, and the state. We were anticipating and talked and discussed at the beginning the idea of the fee waiver. The administration obviously is recommending it, supports it. It was not. I don't think it's accurate to say it was factored into the cost, though I think it is important to say that with $16 million of state funding, I believe the county may be putting some funding in, and then the majority of it being private dollars. The administration is recommending it because we feel it's good policy for the administration to be, for the city to be a financial contributor to the construction of the facilities as well.
If I can ask a follow-up question, you mentioned the $16 million state funding. Is that what the state appropriated this year to the areas that were, because there was a bill, right, if I'm correct on this, that was passed to areas that are going to be housing these HRCs to provide some funding to that? And are we as a city, are our HRCs tapping into that funding as well?
Do you mean the mitigation funding?
Yeah.
That actually is a separate funding source. We do anticipate, not in this first year, the first year, as was our understanding during the legislative session, the first year is more geared towards South Salt Lake and Midvale. But Salt Lake City will be eligible to, it'll be through a grant process to apply for funding through that mitigation fund. The $16 million was a part of the original ask, which was $27 million, 7 ongoing, 20 one time. Where we get from the 20 to the 16 and the one-time dollars for construction is, I'm not going to say amounts because I can't remember the exact amounts, but $1 million or a little over $1 million is going towards opening of the Center for Women and Children in Murray, which is the Volunteers of America that is focused on women with addiction issues and their children. Some of that one-time dollars is also going to the creation of the mobile clinic for with 4th Street Clinic, and so that's how we get from the 20 to the 16. And I believe also some of it's also set aside for conversations about overflow.
Councilmember Kitchen.
All right, so just to be clear, this has already been paid and we're looking for a reimbursement, correct?
That's correct. It was paid at the time that the permits were issued.
Has the city council staff looked at the budget, the general fund impact on this, and what are your thoughts? I don't know if Mary Beth is the right one or if
The general
Jennifer
fund
Bruno.
impact would be
It's the 515.
245,000 approximately, and then impact fee would be 269,000. We
So
would
because that is last year's money, it'll impact this year's, when we refund, it'll impact this year's refunding. We'll refund it out of the revenues, not out of an expenditure account, but it came in last fiscal year.
And
we'll do that through a budget amendment.
Yeah.
And I think in general, the council staff, and I think Sylvia noted this at the beginning of her comments, is just the precedent for the general fund budget impact that it sets as opposed to the actual dollar amount in this particular request. So how do we evaluate those requests on an equal basis? So
Because we eliminated the proposed dollars for impact fee waivers on affordable housing development, correct? That's no longer a part of our conversation, right?
impact fees are still waived on affordable housing.
Are
Yes.
okay.
Yes.
I know that's unrelated, but in my mind they're connected. So thank you.
I don't usually jump in before I've gone through all of you, but both what Councilmember Fowler and Councilmember Kitchen have said have brought up for me with the precedence piece of this conversation, that there actually is a recent precedence with the county's request for us to do a fee waiver on their county health facility just a few blocks from here that was denied by this body. So I think at this time it'd be a good time for us to bring up the folks from Shelter the Homeless Board, and perhaps David, you can begin the conversation with me and with the board about how With that recently happening and our reluctance to set that precedence, that we, I'm surprised that we haven't had opportunities to sit down with Shelter of the Homeless or with yourself and hear about this before today in any extensive way,
Sure.
because we don't do this.
Sure. Well, and that's on me, and I apologize for that. I'm not, I wasn't very involved with the county health department conversation, so difficult for me to provide any kind of contrast. And so I'll just speak squarely from my perspective with the new resource centers and the work with Shelter of the Homeless, the county and the state. I understand the concerns about the precedents being set. I think from my perspective and from the administration's perspective, what is unique about this particular project is it has been a collaborative from the very beginning, from the city's role with identifying sites, the city's role with the county and many partners, community partners, seeking state funding for the creation of the new resource centers, all the way from the design being very collaborative and the ongoing conversations with the construction and the city's role through representation on Shelter of the Homeless board. So for me, I don't see this as the city being on the outside and just looking at a separate request in terms of a fee waiver. I see this very much integrated in the collaborative approach that has been going on with the resource centers, with Shelter of the Homeless, county, state, and others.
I appreciate that perspective, David, because I may be speaking from a different position, and as the chair of the council, I feel like I can say we've been left out from the Shelter of the Homeless perspective of invitations to participate in the groundbreaking of the women's shelter that will be coming on 700 South. We learned about that through the media, and there have been no communications with this body. We've extended actually invitations for your group to come and update us after we had some questions for the county about how the process, the collective impact process was going. And so I don't think we feel that collaborative effort. And yet I will say it really isn't about the dollar amount. I think there is a partnership. I am grateful for the state's participation in this, and I think some conversations would have gone a long way in bringing us along on something that is unprecedented and is very recently established as something we don't do. It's really surprising that we haven't been brought along in this process. I do want to be a good partner. I am going to support this request, but I have a lot of frustrations that that it wasn't a collaborative effort with the county or with the state to choose the sites. That was really taken on by the city, and appropriately so. But it was a good deal of work and a good deal of public feedback that we've received that I feel like has should have entitled us to continued communication in this process. And I'm not setting that at your feet. It's really at the feet of the Shelter of the Homeless.
Well, I appreciate that, Madam Chair, but I will take some responsibility, if not the majority of the responsibility for that. Very much my role with the Shelter of the Homeless, with the construction, with the design process is to be that liaison for the city, not just the mayor's office. And so that responsibility does fall back on me, so I apologize for that, and we'll do a much better job moving forward.
Thank you, David. Councilmember Fowler?
Yeah, so kind of going along this precedent idea, one of the questions I wrote down, and I think it's important for us as we evaluate this fee waiver, similarly to how we evaluated a fee waiver or non-fee waiver for the Public Health Department. In the memo we received, it says that Shelter of the Homeless indicates that if this fee waiver is not approved, then there will be certain areas that cannot be completed. Can one of the representatives from Shelter of the Homeless explain what those areas are for me?
Sure, good question. I think, first of all, I'm Preston Cochran. I'm Executive Director of Shelter of the Homeless. Going back to Madam Chair Mendenhall's comment on, I welcome any opportunity to sit down with anyone, anytime, to bring you up to speed on anything. So please reach out to me. I'm happy to meet with you, your constituents, at any time. So as far as the groundbreaking, again, we apologize, oversight on our end to make sure everyone was invited to the groundbreaking media event. going back to your question, in terms of any areas that might be overlooked within the facility. So right now, when the initial budget for all 3 resource centers was implemented, we're still working through any sort of ways to minimize overhead costs. The tariffs have definitely played an integral part in terms of wood, materials, steel. Those costs have really shot up. And so our initial budget, compared to where we were a year ago from where we are today, is higher for all 3. And so taking the impact and permit fees will go right back into construction costs. So that's the request that we're making.
You have a follow-up?
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate that as far as the construction costs have gone higher, but so I guess it sort of indicates that you wouldn't be able, I mean, would that be, you wouldn't be able to complete it at all, or you would have to change the design of it? I mean, because these are very important to me, and I like the design, and we've all been to our open house meetings, and we've worked with the architect, and she's amazing and great, and so it's important, and again, for the analysis that I believe we have to go through in order to say this is something we feel comfortable in waiving these fees. I sort of need a little more than just construction costs.
Yeah.
So,
And I could speak, so I'm Ben Seastrand with the Gardner Company. We're a local developer, and we've donated our services to help in this process. So we've been involved throughout the design process, and something I can speak to kind of echo what Preston has said about cost. We have seen an increase in cost, and we're working with a moving target as we're getting our numbers back from contractors and their subs. But something that's different about these homeless resource centers that makes them unique is the program. So we're designing the building and what's inside to a specific program, and that includes having office space, having different rooms, it's just much more intensive than just saying, okay, here's a building and here's your basic rooms. I mean, they're looking at it's being designed around this program of how this is going to be an efficient way to deal with this with the clients they're calling. So that is also, we've seen the cost per square foot in the building, all these specific programs that they're implementing, that is also driving up costs significantly. So if we saw, this would go directly into us as we're sitting down and making the program of saying, hey, we can keep this portion of the program because we have these funds. If they were taken away, we'd have to look at what do we have to take out on how we're treating the clients. Does that help?
no, that was great. I
Okay.
appreciate that.
Yeah.
So that explains a lot for me. Thank you.
I think it really is another perfect example of how coming to us to talk to us about this and not, in community councils all across the city, we've all been in community council meetings when a developer's come in and said, this is what I'd like to build if you can support my request for a special exception. You know this process. And if you don't support that, this is what I'm going to build. And that's not a friendly hammer here, especially on something as serious as homeless resources for our city. So Councilmember Johnston, then Kitchen.
So just to we don't know yet what the impact would be. We know there'd be an impact. We don't know the impact it's specifically on the design of those buildings. Is that accurate?
No, I mean, going back to the question, Amy's question would be, we're not going to minimize anything in terms of the integrity, quality of the building itself, or pull out anything that's already designed. What we're looking to do is the fees that we've already paid to put those back into programs that can benefit the residents who will be staying there.
So the fees would go back into programming, not the actual physical building, is what I'm hearing.
Well, we would look at, where we might be short. We're raising money for both programs, and we're raising money for capital.
Maybe I should preface, I'm supportive.
Yeah.
But there's a clarity between the capital cost of the building and the build out, and then the programming that's being paid for, say a service provider goes in, and is that what we're talking about?
I probably did a poor job explaining that. What I was trying to say is this program that's going into the building, I mean, that the funds, we don't have anything to do with that.
Mm-hmm.
But what that program requires as far as the physical space, that is what will be sacrificed.
But you don't know yet
So these
what
funds
part of
would go
that.
directly into making sure that there are the facilities in place so they could, put out the program that's necessary.
Okay.
Does that
Well, yeah, I'm just asking because we know in the design, the kitchens are designed, but they're not going to be built out under the current funding, correct?
Kitchens are designed, but we're working with other nonprofit providers who already have commercial kitchens who might be, why recreate the wheel and utilize and make efficiencies in terms of food and meal preparation.
That's the question. That goes into my question then. Are there pieces you're looking at that would be a part of this? Maybe you don't go into specifics here, I get it, but it was written in the report, and that's where it's prompting the questions here about details. So, but you don't know what parts may be, good term, not fully built out without this?
I mean, we could come back with some specifics if that's what you're, I mean, as far as the exact sum of money that the fee that would be reimbursed,
Okay.
I don't think we have an answer for you today if that would go directly into this.
Okay.
But that's something, if you'd like, we could come up with. I think there's numerous opportunities, there's numerous things that we're looking at as a team
Okay.
that we need to address, so that's something we could easily come up with. There's just, like I said, kind of a moving target. There's a lot of things.
Okay. And then is there any sense of where in the budget we're looking at using this from, David? In this year's budget, where would this 500,000
It would come directly off of permits revenues.
directly
So
out of there?
it would be a
Okay.
reduction in their revenues in fiscal year 19.
Okay. But anywhere else in their budget, though, from the revenues, from the expenditure perspective, David, is there any talk of that on your end? No? Okay.
I think one question too about what are we doing with South Salt Lake? So each site is very unique. The South Salt Lake site itself has a lot more external factors in terms of street upgrades, right-of-way issues, water lines that need to be moved, power lines that need to be moved. We've got over $1.5 million in just hard costs, construction to do just that in terms of being up to code before we can even go vertical in terms of construction. So luckily in Salt Lake, we don't have a lot of those similar issues that we are experiencing in South Salt Lake, but those costs add up very quickly.
The same asking.
And so we're seeking a same fee waiver in South Salt Lake.
So from the council perspective, I said I'm supportive of it because of the purpose the chair talked about, but it does raise questions on our policy because first step, neighborhood house is under construction. We did a land deal with them, but they could very much come back and ask for the permits. We've got multiple sort of programs like this that offer a good public benefit that are not, say, a government agency like the county, and this could lead to those discussions very quickly. So is this now the time we want to do this, or do you want to look in the future for our full policy discussion?
Well, I was just having I had an idea that it doesn't really make me feel a lot better, but that we could deny this fee waiver and instead make the same amount of $515,203.21 as a contribution to the project, so that it isn't processed as a fee waiver. It doesn't really make me feel better because there's process that should have happened that didn't happen, and now there's a threat tied to if we don't follow through with this, we don't get successful HRCs as we've been promised we would. I don't like this.
No,
But I also don't want to set a precedence of doing a fee waiver. So we have a budget amendment open right now. We could add this as a council added item for this amount and not process it as a fee waiver.
Board Chair, where would you propose we pull this donation from?
I think we'd ask
The
David
administration.
Littbacker, the mayor, to make that proposal because right now,
And maybe they could clarify too where the funds, I think the funds would have come from fund balance essentially regardless because it was a reimbursement.
So a portion would come from impact fees and a
Oh,
portion
that's
would come
right.
from fund
Right.
balance. So my suggestion would be if you chose to do a donation, you did the portion of regular permits from the general fund and you refund the impact fees just like you would with any, like you said, affordable housing.
It is affordable housing. Mhm.
That's my suggestion. Or you can do all of it from general fund. Just note that that other amount is sitting in impact fees.
so that's 269,000 impact fee total.
That's right.
Correct.
Okay.
The amounts for public utilities, fire, police, and roadway are broken out a little bit farther above that in the analysis.
Madam Chair.
Hang on, Councilmember Kitchen, I skipped you. You wanna go to
Board Member
Councilmember
Johnston
Luke?
got to the meat of my question, and I'll probably have follow-up.
Okay, go ahead, please.
So as far as the policy discussion is concerned, I'm not inclined to support a reduction if there or a waiving of those fees. If we do have a proposal from the administration on a donation or where that can come from, I'm more than happy to entertain that. But I do think that Councilmember Johnston's comments there, we deal with a lot of nonprofits who do great work in the city, and we don't waive fees for everybody else. And so because of the precedent issue, I think I will not be supporting a waiver, but I would be very happy to look at and consider different ideas on donations from the administration.
Great. Other council members?
Council staff, can you walk me through what the process is for a donation? I don't think I've ever been a part of something like this, so can you talk to me about this?
We've never done something like this, so we're all making it up a little bit.
Okay.
But in terms of forcing this to fit into processes that already exist, the city frequently will treat something like a capital project. You could either handle it in your CIP or you could handle it in a budget amendment like you have one open right now, and contribute funds to make a project happen. So sometimes it's a neighborhood park that they've raised money and you're doing the sort of closing funds and you're appropriating money to finish the project. The other lane that this also fits in that Mary Beth highlighted is you could sort of consider this affordable housing. And if you considered it affordable housing, the city's ordinance allows impact fees to be waived for affordable housing. Or waived, right? They're not charged initially. So you could treat this as a reimbursement of impact fees based on, that this is
Oversight.
essentially affordable housing, even though it's probably not classified that way. I don't know if it's classified that way, but maybe there's a gray area that we can.
Don't want to define it as affordable housing either.
Right, but I think that the city could make that finding that we're refunding that it's in alignment with the ordinance from that perspective. Probably the same net effect. You have 200 and something coming from fund balance and 200 and something coming from impact fees, but at least you're not sending the signal to future organizations that there's sort of an open call for applications for impact fee refunds, because like you said.
Okay.
So from a administrative and council perspective, we have this set up to go to public comment on September 18th and take action on October 2nd tentatively. How do you feel like you can come back to us before September 18th with a different allocation scenario based on what we've talked about? So we can still hold a public comment on the 18th of
Yeah,
September?
absolutely. I mean, I think we have the budget amendment that's open right now that you're hearing next on the agenda. So based on the comments, if that's the direction from the council, we can definitely come back with an alternative proposal, so to speak.
Okay.
And I would say that, I mean, this is just off the top of my head and listening to the conversation, that it would probably be a mix combination of looking at the impact fee waiver, thinking about this in terms of serving low income and temporary housing, and probably general fund balance.
Great. So we've got time on September 4th or September 11th to hear that scenario. And then we will set a public hearing date tonight and keep the schedule the same.
Great. We'll come back.
Anything else, council members? All right. Thank you, everyone, for being with us.
Thank you.
We're going to move on to budget amendment number 1 for fiscal year 2018-19. I think we're going to keep Mary Beth at the table. Thank you. And have Sylvia Richards join us. And of course, Jennifer Bruno can just be here to answer other questions. Sylvia?
Hi. So there are 3 adjustments requested in this budget amendment. 3 from the administration, and then there is 1 council added item. Just briefly, the 3 include the transfer of $6.2 million 6.3 million from Airport and Enterprise Fund to the city's general fund for the consolidation of the airport and city police departments. The second one is assumption of the fiduciary duties related to the Drug Enforcement Administration Metro Narcotics Task Force. And that is, I believe, about $2 million. And then the third item is $75,000 to come from fund balance regarding a larger effort for Jazz Festival. And the item that is the council added item is, thank you, $90,000 to reimburse the RDA for Pioneer Park improvement cost overruns. And we can go through that in more detail. The second page is from the administration is a revenue and expense update, and it looks like overall revenues are down by about $2 million. And Mary Beth, do you want to chime in on that? Or we'll have better information in December, or?
Yeah, so let me explain. These are May updates. June, because we receive most of our taxes, we don't receive them until the end of August. It's hard for me to give you a June update. And then we also have a lot of variables as we're working through the audit that could fluctuate. And until we have a final audit, I don't have a final fund balance number nor a final revenue number. I'll probably have a closer revenue number October-ish. Expenditures are going to have to wait until final CAFR is done in mid-December. That's what we're shooting for, is mid-December.
And more money.
And more money.
So if the council approves the proposed expenditures, fund balance would be estimated at 11.32%, just over 30.8 million, which is 3.6 million above the minimum 10%. And page 3 of the staff report is the general fund balance projections. And then item A, does the council wish to entertain questions? Do you want me to go into more detail about item A1, Madam Chair?
Sorry.
It's okay. Do you want me to go into more detail on item A1, the transfer of the
Council members, do you want her to go into more detail on that? Transfer airport police
do you want to
department?
entertain questions at this point about?
Really, the only question that I would have is, whether both the police department, the Salt Lake City Police Department, and the Airport Police Department are supportive of it. My understanding is that they are.
Okay.
If that is not the case, let me know. But that would really be the only question that I would have at this point.
Yeah, I believe they both are. I think
Okay.
they're both here. I haven't looked around, but I think they're both here if you'd like
Okay.
them to come up and speak. But
No,
this has been a
unless-
collaborative effort
yeah.
between the airport and the
Got a
police
thumbs up from
department.
Chief Brown. Okay.
Yeah, it's been very collaborative between airport and the police department in working on this budget going forward.
Yeah, and just for the record, this has always been an issue that I have never fully understood as to why we have two separate police departments. So I think this consolidation makes perfect sense.
I thought the questions were good about, if maybe Chief wants to come up to talk about the staffing changes and how do we have two chiefs and what happens to one chief and what kind of duplication do we avoid with new titles?
Okay. Good afternoon. Thank you.
Thanks for being here, Chief.
The airport has 66 officers and 2 civilians. What we had planned is to make that an airport bureau to be overseen by a deputy chief, which would be the current chief, Chief Craig Vargo. And so that is the model, and that's where we're moving forward.
And that's in addition to your deputy chief positions in your org chart?
Right. We have 2
Okay.
deputy chiefs now, Deputy Chief Sharman, Deputy Chief Dave Askelin, so this would be a 3rd deputy chief.
Okay. Council members, did you have any other questions? There was civilian positions. You said there's 2.
2.
And is there any duplication with the merger of the bodies?
No, that's staff that they would need out there, so there's no redundancy there.
Okay. Any other questions? Go ahead, Councilmember Johnston.
Quick one. On the impact fees update for streets is about 4.2 million, give or take. some set to expire October of this year. I'm guessing that there's already plans for those.
I don't know, I'll have to get back with you on that. I'm hoping that there are plans for those.
I am too.
Also, we did send an update on impact fees. I think it was too late to get into this staff report, but there is updated information pertaining to the impact fees.
Okay.
But we will follow up with you. We'll
And
get back with you on that.
11.2% for our general fund, is that what we're guessing?
7.3%, yeah. It may be a little better. I mean, I can give you a little bit of optimistic news. In May,
Just don't.
But it's not going to be 12% though.
so in May, our sales tax numbers were, no, it won't be 12%. But in May, I will tell you, our sales tax numbers came in really, really well. Like more than I've ever seen a month come in. So that's a
I'm
good
going to
thing.
have written on the front of the dais here in gold lettering, under promise and over deliver.
Okay,
So,
it didn't come in at all.
Thank you.
Councilmember Fowler, please.
I do have another question for you, Chief Brown. Will this airport bureau just support the airport, or will they be able, if there's anything kind of in the surrounding area of the airport, would be able to provide services out there? Or, I mean, are they kind of just sticking to the same services as they have now? Or
Yeah, and we have to because of some of the FAA regulations
Okay.
and the reimbursements. I mean, if there's an emergency, absolutely. We'd overlook that and we would respond to whatever we needed to go to. But they are dedicated to the airport and the service they provide out there.
Okay, just curious.
Has there been that kind of overlap opportunity if we had a large-scale emergency? Could you have in the past called on?
Yeah, there are MOUs that they would certainly come if the call was given. They would come, and they have a lot of resources that we could use. They have 5 or 6 canines. They have a very extensive bomb squad. So there are some resources in times of need that we could call on.
But because this money is coming through the airport and highly regulated by the FDA,
Right.
we're not going to be
The
calling
FAA
on
is
them for
is
anything,
reimbursing the
just
city for
anything.
those services. You're absolutely right.
Okay, well,
So.
thank you. You learned something new.
And you could stay here if you want for item A2 or not.
All right.
This is the assumption of fiduciary duties for the DEA Metro Narcotics Task Force.
So we do have, no, clarification is on A3, actually, sorry, my bad. So this would allow Salt Lake City to become the host fiscal agency responsible for receiving and managing all task force funds, facilitating the use of the city procurement policies, and required financial reporting and overall fiscal accountability.
But I think, just a quick update, I think Murray has since agreed to keep those 2 employees as Murray City employees, and that the grant that we would now manage would be reimbursing Murray City for those positions.
So it's not really a shift in workload for our city.
No. The same 2 people that are doing the grant managing now, they work for Murray City.
They're going to stay there.
Yeah, they would stay there. We were looking to bring them on board, but now they're saying it's okay, we'll keep them. If it ever should happen that they would leave, we would rehire them as Salt Lake City employees and then treat them like employees that are hired under any grant.
Okay. Questions, council members? Looks good.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks, Chief.
Thank you.
All right, Sylvia, A3.
A3, we do have an update on that, and that is that in the staff report, it mentions that the RFP was issued, but there is a correction that the RFP was not issued, and the administration intends to take council feedback in the ideas and incorporate that into the RFP. And I believe Leah is here, Leah Summers from the mayor's office is here in case you have specific questions.
Okay, council members. I have questions. Does anyone else have questions? Councilmember Rogers?
Yeah, Madam Chair, I guess if we could just go through the policy questions under A3 of our staff report, those were really answer most of my questions.
Okay, so that starts.
It's on
Sylvia, do you want to
A3.
walk us through those?
Let's see. So the request for proposal RFP process, I just clarified that the RFP was not issued, and so I think that question can be laid to rest. The metrics for pilot program, the council may wish to ask the administration what success would look like for this new program and what metrics could be tracked to show progress. Is that something that
Hi, Leah.
you can address, Leah?
Thanks for being here.
Hi, thank you for having me. And I also just quickly, while I have a moment, would like to extend a thank you to council chairs and staff for accommodating this item in the budget amendment. So as far as tracking success, I think there are a lot of different ways that we could track success in a program like this. With numbers, the number of events, whether that be program events or festival days, number of participants and festival attendees, number of artists and groups participating within the festival and programs, and that speaks to artist retention and creation of artistic jobs within that sector, and a participant experience survey are all ways that immediately could start being tracked to measure success. In the longer term, programs like this, when they're successful, you start to see them duplicate, and more of them tend to pop up. So that's another thing that we could track in a longer term setting.
Excuse me, were there any other questions?
Yeah.
The next one is ongoing or one-time.
Ongoing funding, if this is one-time funding and if it's going to be in next year's budget, so.
Thank you for that question, Councilmember Rogers. So this request is for one-time funding. It's a little bit strange because we're asking for 2019 festival dollars to go to the 2019 festival that it won't happen until fiscal year 20. So there won't be a request in the FY20 budget, but then come FY21, there will be another request, and that will be ongoing with reports about how this first festival went after a RFP was issued, and we could set some specific measures and expectations for what happens within the program.
And who would be managing the contract?
Thank you for that question, Council Chair. It hasn't been decided as of now, although I would say that Megan Risbin within the Arts Council is very well suited to manage a contract like that. That's her job, is to manage contracts for performing arts programs.
And would the Arts Council be issuing the RFP then?
Certainly, I think that the mayor's office could work with the Arts Council, or the Arts Council could work with the mayor's office. The person or entity who spearheads the creation of the RFP doesn't necessarily have to be the contract manager at the completion of it.
Councilmember Fowler?
Thanks. Can I actually go back just a minute to have Mary Beth explain the funding again and budget to me? Please.
For this. So there was $35,000 that was budgeted in the regular fiscal year 19 budget. That was for the Jazz Festival in the Gallivan Center that has already occurred.
Okay.
This is an additional $75,000 that they are requesting for a different type of pilot program.
That's what I was thought. And that will come out of the 2020 budget, essentially. It'll come out this year in this budget amendment. But then you were saying about 2020 and 2021, and that's like, I can't think about tomorrow, so I need some explanation.
I think we'll have to work through that. The $35,000 has been ongoing funding that has been in the mayor's budget for 2 years now.
Okay.
I suspect that may be a combination of the 35 and some additional, but we'll have to work through that during the budget process.
But the current 75 will come from fund balance.
Which is one-time funding.
I'm curious about what has led to the desire to make such an investment, as we have, we saw a pullback in funding from the administration for excellence in the community, which does free jazz concerts year-round. And then, there have been some budget amendments around that, or adjustments from the council end. And so I'm wondering about what data do we have? Typically, the Arts Council would come to us and say something like, here's the spectrum of opportunity for arts and culture investment in the city for different demographics, and here's how various programs are filling those demographic gaps, so to speak. So I'm wondering about what kind of research has been done to show that their demand is there, that we aren't filling this demographic arts and culture gap already with existing programming, and kind of where's the Arts Council at this table?
Thank you for that question. So I think that some larger planning is going on currently within the Arts Council to do a larger scale gap and needs analysis for programming throughout the city. For this particular ask, I think there are a couple of things that can point to the need, which is there are a number of, and you mentioned Excellence in the Community, which is a great program that does offer free concerts that are very family friendly, open to everybody, and very well attended. The purpose of this request is to provide something that, a program that is a little bit more interactive and educational in nature and be targeted specifically toward youth. And we have other similar programs like Salty Cricket and the Gifted Musical School programs that are have been very successful. They have waiting lists, but they're focused on classical music. And so I think that the large attendance of the Excellence in the Community concerts and the wait lists for the after-school music programs definitely can show a need that an after-school program that focuses particularly on jazz music would be well, not well attended, but well utilized. Additionally, we have several jazz higher education programs. The University of Utah has a great program. The Utah State University has a jazz program. Weber State University and Brigham Young University both have large notable jazz ensembles within their music departments. And with a program that offers exposure and education to youth in a, an after-school or year-round setting, that can act as a feeder to some of those programs, as well as create a little bit more attraction for, and I'm a little all over the place here, but we're also thinking about workforce development and offering more diverse programs. We get a lot of feedback from larger companies about attracting talent to Salt Lake City, and there's a perception that Salt Lake City doesn't have a lot of diverse opportunities for diverse populations. And so to start to chip away at that in any way that we can is definitely very important to Mayor Biskupski and creating opportunities for everybody in the city. And this is just one opportunity to do that, showing what has been successful in other areas of the city and filling a need of after-school jazz focused.
I think that these are great ideas. It's the beginning of a conversation, I hope, and it seems like something that would come to us through an ACE events application, or come to the city through an ACE events application. And I think it's two different things too, to talk about after school programming when we've battled for Youth City dollars, which are highly in demand, sell out those opportunities. And so there's a lot of ways that we support, as a city, we support the youth community. And I think this really fits into the context of that broader discussion of what's the community asking for specifically. And then there's this annual festival too that it's not really making sense to me, and we're probably going to run out of time on this issue and need to bring it to a future discussion because we do have a time sensitive at 5 o'clock. But Councilmember Wharton, you had something you wanted to say.
Yeah, I'm really interested in changing that perception too, but I'm just still curious about how this does that, and I also am curious about whether, if there was more investigation into how we could build those components into existing programs, would we be able to get more than we would by starting a new program? So I would just ask
To come back, maybe.
Yeah, if you could maybe address those things when you come back. Mm-hmm. You don't have to answer now, so.
I think we'll have to lob questions and ask you to come back to us. And there's also the special events permit fees discussion that we said we would address later in the year, and this would really fit in very well, I think, as we're looking at the potential for a subsidy of event permitting fees, which this as an event would still have a fee associated with it.
Yeah, that was my only other addition, is just that we already have, you know, these other great programs that are coming to us and saying that they're struggling, like Arts Festival and Pride Festival. And, you know, how do we do that and make sure we don't lose one of those while also maintaining or bringing on something new if we determine that that's what's best?
So Leah, can we ask you to come back and keep talking with us? Councilmember Luke, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, it's okay. So before you go, and since we are going to have an additional discussion and you'll be bringing back more information, one thing that I really do like, you know, in this proposal concept is the request for proposal, you know, from the organizations. I think that's good. What I would actually like to see when you come back, though, is an option for more of an RFQ, or, you know, it could be an RFP, but instead of having the money appropriated, the $75,000 appropriated, we essentially open it up and let people come to the city with a proposal of what they would do for whatever, you know, amount it would be. And then we vet that information as opposed to, and then, you know, the council will be in a better position when, you know, the administration can then come forward and say, okay, this is specifically what we will be doing with this $75,000 or however much it is, instead of just doing an open appropriation like this. So I'd like to see if that is a possibility.
Councilmember Fowler.
I promise I'll only be 1 minute, but just to piggyback on this, and something that you said, Madam Chair, was that it feels like we're conflating the Jazz Festival with this after-school program, and I don't understand that. Everything you've said, Leah, I agree with and appreciate and want the diversity and want access in all these different ways, but it feels like we're somehow conflating these two, and that seems strange to me. So I like this idea of that Charlie's come up with, if it's feasible to say, here's an RFQ, we have this money, you know, maybe this is what we can do with it, so.
Okay, thank you, Leah. And just to be sensitive to the time that we have here, we have one more item. I-1, the reimbursement to RDA CBD for Pioneer Park improvements, which was something we anticipated when we made that appropriation from the general fund. Oh, it's already been approved in the RDA board. Oh, thank you. Okay, with that, are there any other questions on Budget Amendment 1? Okay, so we're looking to hold a public comment. We'll set the date tonight, and we'll hold public comment on September 18th and take council action tentatively on October 2nd. And we will look forward to working with the administration with what the feedback requested on that jazz conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we're going to need to slightly delay item 3, our funding our future transit update, for our time certain at 5 o'clock of the Northwest Quadrant fact-finding and Inland Port Board General Overview. I want to invite up Derek Miller, who is the Inland Port Board Authority Chairperson, and Laura Fritz, who is a member of the Inland Port Board on behalf of Salt Lake City. And James Rogers, do you want to sit there? Because I really wanted to make you sit there. I think you got to go sit in the chair. Don't you agree, Mr. Chair? That
whichever is the hotter seat.
That's definitely the hotter seat. And before we turn it over to our esteemed panel of guests tonight, this is the first of 3 fact-finding nights that the council will hold with somewhat various silos of interest, but not necessarily isolated. So we wanted to begin the discussion with you 3 and invite the Chair Miller, Mr. Chair Miller, to come and give us his vision of this role and of the Port Board, talk about whatever it is that you'd like to actually we have 60 minutes on the clock. That's up to you how long we go, and hopefully allow time for questions and answer at the end. And whatever tag teaming needs to happen as the discussion goes along. We really appreciate James and Lara for being here with us. So with that, Derek Miller, please kick us off.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I don't know if you do this here, but all legislative presentations start by saying my name, I guess, for the record. I don't know if you do that. It's Derek Miller.
Go ahead.
In case you wanted to know.
And your other role as the president
And I'm
of the Chamber of
here as the chair of the Inland Port Authority. And I'm grateful to be here. Thank you for the opportunity, and thank you for the invitation to all the members of the council. And thank you for your interest. Thank you for your help in getting us to where we are today. What I'd like to do, well, first of all, I promise that I'm not going to speak for 60 minutes, so there'll be plenty of time for questions. But what I'd like to do is just give you an update on the work of the board, what we've done so far, and what direction we're headed in the future, if that would be okay. The Inland Port Authority Board met on July 30th. It was our second meeting, but the first one that we were actually able to conduct some business after a false start. And as I referenced, thanks to the help of the City Council and getting some things back on track, we were able to meet officially for the first time and begin to self-organize. We were sworn in, 11 members of the board, 3 of them that you see here before you today. And grateful to be able, maybe I'm not grateful, but the fact is I was selected as the chair, and grateful, definitely grateful that council member James Rogers was selected as the vice chair. We were offered by motion as a pair, and it's to that I attribute the fact that it was a unanimous vote to have James on the ticket. The board also, once we were organized and had a chair and a vice chair, voted to adopt and to put ourselves subject to the Open Public Meetings Act of the state. And we then formed 3 committees that I'll talk to you about in just a moment. And they were really formed around the most pressing tasks that the board felt like needed to be addressed. We also heard public comment at that board meeting, and I want to mention to you, I think it's worth noting that the vast majority of the public comments that were offered expressed concern for the environmental impacts that the Inland Port project might have on the Northwest Quadrant. And I'll address in just a moment, it's obvious why I think that's important, but I'll address in just a moment why I'm mentioning it here. The first subcommittee that was formed was to search for an executive director. The legislation calls for the hiring of an executive director. I think this is maybe one of the most important tasks that lie before the board. Certainly it's the most pressing task. And I say that because I want to draw attention to the fact that all of the board members have other jobs. This is a volunteer, part-time board. That does not minimize in any way the importance of the work that we have before us or the responsibility that we feel. But I'm sure all of you, like myself, have experienced going to meetings, talking about very important issues, making very important decisions, and then coming back at some period in the future and having the exact same meeting and discussion and decisions again with no work having been done in the meantime. That's why it's so important that we hire this full-time executive director whose day-to-day job it will be to carry out those decisions based on those discussions. The board also recognized at the time the importance of finding an experienced professional through a broad search. And that is important. I hope it speaks for itself, but I'll underscore the importance of it because this needs to be someone, in my opinion, and expressed by the opinion of the board, as someone with experience in building just these kinds of inland ports, experience in dealing with the economic impact, and experience in dealing with the environmental issues. Members of this subcommittee include, named as its chair, James Rogers, Carlos Braceros, Michael Jensen, and Greg Buxton. The second subcommittee that was formed at our board meeting was the Budget and Business Plan Subcommittee. The legislation provides for 2 categories of funding to the board. The first category is $475,000 for an economic impact study. that would form the basis of the business plan. The second category of funding is $1.5 million. This is given as port startup costs for the port, which would include hiring the executive director that I referenced earlier, capital funding search, and community engagement. I want to stress the community engagement and how important we think this is as a board. I'm grateful that this council also has community engagement efforts. And I would really, I really think it's important that we align those efforts. I say align not to indicate a duplication of efforts, but to make sure that we continue this sort of communication that's happening right now. The third subcommittee that was formed was the Tax Differential or Tax Incremental Finance Subcommittee. Tax increment financing is one of the most important issues that will be overseen by the Inland Port Board. It was one of the most controversial issues in forming the board and how that would be handled. So I want you to know that we take this subject also very seriously. This will be critical in attracting private capital, recruiting businesses, and putting in the necessary infrastructure and utilities, as well as, not to forget, actually building the port. Additionally, some projects are already, or I should say already were, in early stage process before this board was created in this geographic area. And the board wants to ensure that these projects can proceed in a timely fashion. Members of this subcommittee include, as the chair, Ben Hart, Stuart Clayson, Nicole Cottle, Laura Fritz, and Francis Gibson. I'm just realizing now that I failed to mention to you the members of the the Budget and Business Plan Subcommittee. Those members include myself, Ben Hart, Laura Fritz, Tudor Ogden, and Francis Gibson. The last thing I want to mention to you is moving forward. The board is scheduled to meet Wednesday, August 29th at 4 p.m. At this meeting, we will receive a report from the subcommittees, discuss action items, and make decisions on how we will proceed with those necessary action items. Additionally, the board will hear presentations on the planned transportation projects from both the state and the county. I also want to let you know that in working with Laura Fritz, it's our intent to receive a report on the master plan that was created by Salt Lake City. I think it's important for the board to understand that so much work has already been done, particular to the master plan over the last 12 to 18 months, and that we have a very strong foundation to build upon, which includes the incorporation of an inland port in that master plan for the Northwest Quadrant that the city produced. The board has also expressed interest in having the consulting group that did the feasibility study come and present at one of our public board meetings on the vision of what an inland port in this area would look like. We expect this meeting to be held next Wednesday at the West Point Center of the Salt Lake Community College as the first of several planned board meetings in the community. I note that this was at the suggestion of James Rogers, who, as you know, represents this district. It represents the Northwest Quadrant in his district. And I would also note that the city, county, and state staff, those that were critical in bringing us from a staff standpoint where we are today with the Inland Port Authority Board, that they've also been advised to participate and they've also been notified to participate and advise us in this process along the way. As I mentioned, I appreciate the council's desire to hold these fact-finding missions. I'm grateful for the opportunity to provide this report. The community engagement that we have will be extremely important. And I'm using the word engagement intentionally. Some people talk about community education. For me, that sounds like we may be talking about community indoctrination, which is not what we're talking about. It's not our intent, and I know it's not your intent either, to go out to the community and to convince them of all the great benefits that this project will provide, but rather that we get their input and that it be a two-way process. I believe that we'll end up with a better product and a better outcome at the end of that process. which is again why I'm grateful that you're holding these meetings, and why one of the things that I believe the board needs to get involved in sooner rather than later is that engagement process. We plan to hold one board meeting each quarter in the community in order to also support that effort. And with that, I'll conclude my remarks. I'd love to hear from Laura or Councilman Rogers where they can fill in the gaps.
Go for it, Laura.
Actually, Derek did an outstanding job in outlining the first meeting and the subsequent committees that have been established. Those committees have now all met for the first time, and there was much discussion about process and protocol, at least in the two committees that I serve on, which is, as you've learned, the Budget and Business Plan and the Tax Differential Committee. We are very mindful of bringing the conversations that are held in the subcommittees back to the board so that there is a full conversation at the board level, which is, of course, where the public input could be taken and accepted.
And then I just want to add, appreciate Derek Miller giving me credit, but this is just part of the process of, I think, listening to the community. And the recommendation of having a meeting held in the community was brought forth by the West Point Community Council Chair. And I brought that to the board. So I just want to just show that there are a lot of, there's willingness on the board. I mean, there are a lot of people that think they're dubious and that there's malfeasance going on, but there isn't. It is completely open and transparent. The chair opened it up for comments, which wasn't on the agenda before, for public comment. He opened that up. There were people that commented. So I just want to stress out to the public that there's nothing being done behind closed doors. It is all open. And I'm more than willing to talk about our subcommittee meeting, which is in charge of overseeing the hiring of the executive director for the Inland Port. And how do you do that? So we talked about that. How do you figure out how you're going to hire that person? That was the first question. And it's thrown out there that you've got to have a national firm. You've got to have several national firms that are well versed in transportation or in moving logistics, that type of thing. So we need to have that national help in researching. Also, we have a great ally with our airport executive director. He's got a knowledge of ports more than anyone else probably in this state. So he and I have had an impromptu meeting about discussions, and he's going to make recommendations that I'm going to take to the subcommittee and take back to the board itself. So we have Salt Lake City voices being heard, and I'm grateful for the board because they're all open to it. They know that the number one issue that we're hearing about is clean air. It's about the impacts on the community. So the board is well versed in knowing the issues that are confronting Salt Lake City.
Thank you. I have questions, but let's go to Councilmember Kitchen and work our way around the group, and then Johnston after
I just want you all to know that there are no armrests on these chairs.
the inhumanity. You do look a little awkward there, James. Councilmember Kitchen.
Thank you, Board Chair, or Council Chair, excuse me. Okay, thank you for being here, Derek. I wanted to ask a few clarifying questions. The $1.5 million budget for I can't remember what you called that subcommittee or
funding money.
Funding for startup costs and things of that nature. I believe the legislation calls out a timeline for hiring the executive director. Is that correct? And if so, what exactly is that timeline and where are you at?
You know, that's a great question that we're going to bring to the board that we discussed in our subcommittee. The legislation says that there's a deadline in November to hire this individual, and that is something that we as a subcommittee don't think is attainable. So we're going to go back to the board, present that, and hopefully get approval that, yeah, we need to extend that because we want to make sure it's the right person for the right job.
Okay. You also mentioned that this $1.5 million budget will also help you with your capital funding efforts. Talk to me about what that means exactly.
One of the things that the consultants noted in their feasibility study was the importance of this being a public-private partnership, that it should not all be on the backs of the taxpayers, which I certainly agree with. And there is a lot of good models, good examples out there for private funding of both ports as well as inland ports. But it takes putting a project together, a prospectus together, and it takes marketing. And so that's what I meant by that comment.
Great. As far as the building of the port itself, I realize that this is such an enormous project that it's really hard to even articulate what that process might look like, at least from today's standpoint. So that'll be a follow-up question maybe down the road that I'd love to get some clarity on. But you mentioned Salt Lake City's work on our master plans, either through the city itself and the RDA. And I wonder if you intend to do any sort of formal endorsement or adoption of the work that's already been done by Salt Lake City?
It would probably be out of line for me to speak on behalf of the board on that subject because we haven't discussed it yet. So what the comments that I made in support and in complement to the master plan that was done is based on my own knowledge of the master plan. And as I said, that I believe that it provides a good foundation. But I think we need to have that, we will have that presentation at a board meeting by the city on what is included in the master plan. I'm guessing that it won't be adopted whole cloth because I think there are just some things that will need to be adjusted as a function of the matter of time and as things evolve. I just can't say one way or the other right now.
Great.
Councilmember Johnston, did you have something?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for being here, all three of you, even though you had to be here. The first question I have is the three subcommittees. One is the tax increment subcommittee that's meeting concurrently with your business planning subcommittee. Help me understand, you said there's some projects already in the pipeline that were pre-existing to the formation of the board that need to be addressed by this subcommittee in tax increment. Help me understand that piece.
Laura may be able to address this with more specificity to the extent that that there may be confidential information on projects that both the city and the county and maybe the state are working on, but let me just address it conceptually, and that is this. EDC Utah, as you know, is always working at recruiting companies. It's my understanding that some of them were looking at the Northwest Quadrant prior to this board being created. Maybe even prior to an inland port being considered in this area. So that's what I meant when I referenced projects that are ongoing.
Okay.
And Councilmember Johnson, you may remember that the RDA board adopted 2 CRA plans. One was for the area north of I-80 for the Northwest Quadrant. I think the property owners are very interested in having a conversation with the Inland Port Board about additional contribution. The second was for Stagwell Rail, and unfortunately, they have been kind of caught up in the Inland Port bill, and so there has been no decision made on their ask for tax increment. So that might be another project that would come in front of the board. Again, in our first meeting, we really talked more about process because tax differential is different from tax increment, and that tax increment has a very specific process within 17C that we have to follow. And tax differential does not have a same process, or any process for that matter, defined within code. So for us, that became very important to start to have a conversation around what would a process look like to bring ideas in front of the Inland Port Board.
Got a follow-up from Councilmember Fowler, then Kitchen.
May I just underscore something that Laura mentioned? I think it's really important at this point not be lost, and that is what I failed to mention, but Laura did, is that the subcommittee is not discussing or making decisions on specific projects, but as Laura said, the process by which the board would do that.
Councilmember Fowler?
So that leads to another follow-up question, but I'll ask my first one. Since this sort of looks like and feels a little bit like an RDA CRA type of area, has I don't know what you can and can't talk about, but has the subcommittee or the members of the board considered adopting a similar process to 17C as if it's not broke, there's no need to fix it type of idea?
I don't think those decisions have been fleshed out quite yet.
And then after a follow-up question that you made me think of, Derek, was that, so within your subcommittees, I imagine then the process would be to say, here are what we think should happen, and then it would be adopted by the full board
Make recommendations, yes.
Yeah, okay.
Councilmember Kitchen?
My question's already been answered, thanks.
Comment.
Councilmember Johnston, then Wharton.
The second part. So thank you for the answer to that. I'm looking forward to the business plan, particularly, as we've all talked about this and talked about it as a foundational piece of this for the next decades. Just under half of the inland ports in District 2, in my district, south of I-80, and I support James Rogers being on the board, and he's been very open and a good representative of our needs as well. I want to reiterate second concern below environmental impact for the citizens in my area is that we're surrounded on two sides by rail. The two sides actually connect us to the city are separated by rail that go north, south, and east, west out to there. We're surrounded on four sides by state highways, which cut us off as well, all of which could be in the years and decades to come taxed by increased traffic, which would really harm the neighborhoods. So I wanted to put it out there as many places as possible that this is a really direct impact on quality of life for folks and their ability to get in and out of the city and to jobs and anything else. So I want to put it out there as a source of concern for a lot of residents on the west side as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Councilmember Wharton, then Fowler.
Hello, thanks for coming. So I understand, I think second to the environment, the concerns from most of my residents are about transparency. And I understand that what was reported in the paper about the rationale for not wanting to be arbitrary about closing meetings. But what about like notice requirements for subcommittee meetings? Will the public be given notice of when subcommittee meetings are meeting so that they could contact people that are on the subcommittee about an issue that might be discussed? So sidestepping the arbitrariness of closing meetings, could there at least be that notice period?
I think the answer is yes, there could be, but maybe I'll address the issue of the transparency more broadly first, if that's okay.
Sure.
As I mentioned, the board accepted as its first item of business to make itself subject to the Open Public Meetings Act. And it was our intention in doing so that all of the board meetings would be public, would be noticed, and follow those laws to the letter. When we started to talk about how we would organize and whether or not we needed to divide up into subcommittees, and obviously you know that ultimately that was the decision, we were advised by council that those subcommittees were not subject to public meetings. And so because of that advice from council, we did not hold those subcommittee meetings as open and public meetings. Now, since that time, since that decision was made, a question has come up. A question has come up from advocacy groups, from the public, from the residents of this area, as well as through the media, that should the board hold itself to a higher standard? Should it not just do the minimum required by the law, but should it go further than what the law requires? I think that that's a fair question. I think that that's a good question. I think that that's a question that the board needs to discuss, and it's my intention to raise that question at our next board meeting and have in a public setting and an opportunity to hear from the public whether or not we should hold ourselves to that higher standard.
Well, I would certainly encourage that, and at the very least say that if the meetings aren't going to be open, like, people need to know at least when the subcommittees are meeting and who is on what subcommittee. And I think it's important that people have contact information for the people on those committees as well, because otherwise, if subcommittees are completely able to operate in the dark, I think that the concern from residents is that significant decisions will be made in the subcommittees, and then it will, the board will just sort of approve it.
Thank you for that suggestion.
Councilmember Fowler.
Yeah, I just wanted to say something really quickly that I think as we all experienced together in some way the formation of the inland port, there was certainly some trepidation from me. I was concerned about how this was going to work and what was going to work and who was going to be making these decisions. And then as we came together and sort of worked through this bill a little bit to get the formation going, I want to say that I'm certainly grateful that the three of you are sitting here today and willing to talk to us, and certainly grateful that you're on the board and are there doing the work that you're doing. And I appreciate it, because as I said, there have been a lot of concerns throughout all of this, but it gives me a little bit of, it calms my anxiety a little bit to know that three people I admire and I know are working hard for the city are also working. And this is not to any other council board member out on the Inland Port as a diss of any sort. It's just saying I'm grateful that you're here today, and Derek, that you took time to come talk to us today, because it is important that we, as we've worked for this Inland Port, and as we worked hard trying to work together with the state and the county and all of the different entities, that we also feel connected, continue to be connected to this, so we can stay connected with our constituents. So it really means a lot to me that you're here today, Derek. So thank you for that, and good work, kids.
Thank you.
I wanted to hear you talk about the importance of the business plan, and if in that business plan you think that like financial scenarios may be proposed in order to execute the phases of the business plan.
The answer to your specific question is yes. And the answer to your more general question on what would be included in the business plan, I'd love to defer that question to Laura, because she had some wonderful thoughts, very useful thoughts that she shared with that subcommittee, and I think it'd be helpful for you to hear them as well. Do you remember what they were?
Do you mind, Laura?
Oh, I think I remember.
No pressure.
So the first is we need to better understand the organizational structure of what this board and the ensuing entity will look like. That includes organizational documents, making sure that we understand what the budget is, the financial scenarios, all sort of the organizational things we have to do as an entity. The second is really the business case. What are the types of companies that we're going to be looking to recruit? What is the supply chain in the Northwest Quadrant, and how can we supplement and aggregate that? How do we work in global trade? And how do we augment that for Salt Lake City? The next big, in the state, and the next area is really the development. What are the things that need to happen to truly make this an inland port? Is it an intermodal facility? Is it roads? Is it, what are those pieces to the puzzle that truly make this an inland port? Last but not least, sustainability. Second to last, I lied. Sustainability is very important. We've heard it from the community. We've heard it from various organizations, NGOs, and we want to make sure that we're being very mindful of incorporating that as part of our business planning, as we did when we did the implementation strategy in the redevelopment agency. Last but not least, we also want to make sure that we are marketing this as a product, that this isn't just one facility or one piece of it, but that we're really marketing it as a global trade opportunity and an opportunity for our business community to thrive.
I would agree with you, Derek. That was pretty good.
I wrote it all down as she was saying.
And it sounds like the business plan is quite important to the development of the port for the board. So my next question is, with these three subcommittees working in tandem, and your mention of projects already in the pipeline that may access that tax differential or tax increment, how does that work with the reality of the time it will take to hire an executive director, which may or may not coincide with going out for a bid for the development of the business plan, and the time it will take to create that and be adopted by the board? How is it that you could contemplate tax increment deals or projects within the port and with port tax increment dollars before you have that business plan?
I think it's one of the reasons why we need to be informed and guided by the master plan that the city put together. I think that'll help make that decision. It's hard for me Madam Chair, to answer, I recognize and agree with your question, the concern you've expressed. It's hard for me to adequately answer you by telling you what we're going to do, because I haven't yet received the briefing from that tax increment committee, and I'm not aware of what projects currently are in process. The scope of those projects, what the nature of those projects, if they would complement an inland port. I'm just at a loss for information because I haven't been to the full board meeting yet and received that briefing.
I understand that. I think for me, it is not a question of what those projects might be, because if we don't have the business plan and you don't know what your funding scenarios are in order to achieve the phases of development that you will want to achieve, then it seems that regardless of the proposal, it may be premature to consider entering into any kind of a deal for a project before you really know what your plan is, even if it seems like this would fit with a port, or this would complement an inland port, before it's really been defined. So I think any kind of a project proposal is premature before you know where you're going with the business plan and how you're going to finance its success.
I guess the difference is whether or not it may be premature or whether it definitely is premature.
And
I would agree with maybe.
Madam Chair, I think also we had in our RDA meeting today, we had the 9 line, right? We talked about it's been how long? 2.5 years? Yeah. So for me, that's why it's so important that we hire the right person, because I'm afraid that these steps are going to be continuing down the line. And as we hire this individual, they'll be drinking from the fire hose, right? Understanding what's going on in the Northwest Quadrant, and hopefully be able to be there to help make these decisions and guide that ship. So we have that head of the ship steering it.
And to that end, if you don't mind, Councilmember Rogers is right. This could be a very long process, made even longer by the fact that there is really no definition by which we are to collect or move forward with creating tax differential areas. So there is this whole, not only are we going to talk about creating them, but ultimately we need to define the process by which they get created. So it could be a little bit longer process. Clearly, as a committee, we are very mindful of the fact that there is a business that moved forward with their location and their operations, believing at the start they were working with Salt Lake City, and now we're working with an inland port board. And so that is one that we are talking about at the committee level. We don't have a recommendation to bring to the board yet, but it is something we're very mindful of.
I appreciate that, and I think along those lines, my request then, as friendly as it's a friendly request because I have no control over any of this, but that you make these processes as transparent as possible, particularly in the consideration of projects prior to having a business plan. That I think as a RDA board member, that gives me a lot of pause to think about committing tax increment dollars to any kind of a project before we have a CRA defined in a project area plan, for example. So as you develop that process, that would be my request, if I may be so bold.
I want you to know I see the wisdom in what you're suggesting.
Well, thank you. I'll look forward to continued conversations then as you guys contemplate whatever proposals may be coming your way. And as a member of the public, I feel a sincere commitment from you as the board chair to have these conversations in the public realm. And we appreciate, and then as a taxing entity, I appreciate that also. Council members, other questions? I remembered that I had one more question, which was, has the board engaged with Rio Tinto and the Colmena Group, who Salt Lake City has a development agreement with north of I-80, and had an update from them yet on their status of work?
The board has not.
Is that in your plans?
Yes.
Okay. Great. Council members, anything else on this? Then we thank you, Derek Miller, for being with us and taking the time tonight, and appreciate your receptivity to our desire to have public conversations in alignment with the goals of the board and share information. Certainly, we appreciate Lara and James' participation in that, and we'll look forward to future conversations.
Thank you. Anytime.
Thank you. Okay, and that didn't take as long as you promised, Mr. Miller. It was not 60 minutes. And so we can jump back to the Funding Our Future Transit update conversation, if you don't mind, and invite Russell Weeks from the council office, John Larson, our Transportation Division Director, and Julian Sabula from Transit Program Manager from the Transportation Division to join us. Thank you. And Russell, perhaps will get us started.
So, council members, as you know, the first half of Funding Our Future involved the council's decision to use the 0.05% increase for transit. And in the crush of budget, the council actually laid out 4 criteria in a contingent appropriation for the city and UTA to work toward an interlocal agreement on using that money. And if I may, I just want to read the 4 criteria. Number 1, increasing coverage for underserved areas, particularly the west side, but not excluding other underserved areas of the city. 2, increasing ridership, particularly in the city's downtown core. And 3, building out infrastructure in the transit and master plan routes. And finally, 4, the budget and timeline would be based on 1000 North, 600 North, 200 South, 900 South, and 2100 South Streets. That's improving transit on that. 400 South Street would be the last route implemented. That's what the council adopted when it adopted the budget. Now, in the interim, the Mayor Biskupski's administration has been talking continually with UTA, and they're here to brief the council on those discussions.
Thank you, John. Before you get started, and perhaps you could help me recognize our friends from UTA who are in the audience.
Yes. We have 3 from UTA. We have, just making sure they're, so we have Laura Hanson, who's the planning director for UTA, and then we have Nicole Bordeaux, who is one of the vice presidents. She's does government relations, and planning is under her group. And then we have Lauren, who does the operations.
That was pretty impressive that you knew their titles right off the top of your head.
I probably
on the
got
spot.
them wrong, but I think hopefully close enough that they don't resent me.
And I just always have to ask you, John, to pull that mic right up and be loud and proud when you talk to us.
There we go.
Madam Chair, we'd also be remiss if we didn't recognize Jennifer McGrath, who is working hard for the city.
Correct.
Thank you, Jennifer, for being here too.
We stole her from UTA, and we're glad to have her.
All right, continue on.
Okay, so we sent a one-pager that should be in your packet. Looks something like this, that outlines what we've been working on with UTA. So really, there's a lot of elements that we discussed that are part of this first rollout of the Transit Master Plan implementation, and the biggest and most prominent is the increase in bus service with UTA. So there is precedence nationally for a city to do, what we're calling service buy-ups, but we're the first city in Utah to do it. So we're kind of blazing a trail here as we go. And I think it took Seattle almost 3 years to get theirs in place. We've been trying to do ours in 3 months. We're, the only thing that makes it possible for us to be moving as fast as we are is I think we have a fantastic relationship, and UTA has been, they've been fantastic partners, and we're grateful for that, and look forward to continuing to work with them moving forward. We've been meeting almost weekly with them, which even during summer, July, is kind of a challenge. We have a draft of a draft for an interlocal agreement. The timing is really quite challenging because, as you are aware, UTA is getting a brand new board that starts November 1, I believe. And so ideally, we would have had at least something in place that the outgoing board would be able to, even if not fully adopt, but maybe endorse. I have a hard time seeing that happen before their final meeting, which is in September, just given the fact that just the back and forth and the mechanisms to do this right. But I think at a very least we can get some intent language, and then keep working on getting that draft in place. We still have a tight time constraint for getting a draft, to have an agreement signed if we are going to roll out service as anticipated in August of 2019, because UTA, they need to order buses and hire mechanics and drivers, and that takes time. And really, we need to have be able to get something done in time for them to roll this into their 2019 budget. So they have a calendar year budget, which further keeps things interesting. So anyway, all that for context. This is our initial briefing, and we wanted to talk with you about intent language. So we could either go straight to questions, or we could go through each of the 5 bullets in the intent language.
What do you want to do, council members? Questions now or intent language first? Okay.
I recently just read an article about the transit rideshare program that is happening in other cities, and I got really excited about it. I was like, hey, wait, we're going to do that here. So thanks, you guys, for that. Because it's working out in other cities, and there's some of the same type of things that we're trying to do here, and people are kind of still piloting some of these programs a little bit, but I was really excited to read the article, so.
Thanks, glad to hear that.
Thanks
Thanks for funding it. Okay, so let's dive in. So the first principle, or these are kind of like guiding principles for the interlocal agreement, would be that we work together. The end goal is to maximize the money we have, and that if we find efficiencies, like if this new ride-sharing program makes it so that we can reduce bus service or paratransit service, that would just be reinvested right back into the system. The second one is Salt Lake City and UTA recognize that the Transit Master Plan success is interdependent with the WFRC Regional Transportation Plan. Local and regional investments should be complementary to maximize the benefits of each. So this makes me think of north-south routes, and the way that we're going to be using Salt Lake City money mostly for east-west routes, but they need to be seamlessly integrated with the north-south routes, and that as part of this, we're expecting a commitment from UTA that as additional regional money comes on board, that that would go to bus service, which would benefit everyone.
Do you expect an explicit commitment in terms of a percentage, or having a formula by which to measure how much of a contribution we may expect?
Ideally, from a Salt Lake City perspective, that would be great. I'm not sure if that's possible. At a minimum, I think we can get a commitment that those north-south routes would be prioritized.
in their funding
Yes.
considerations.
Right. And which is very real now that we have that county fourth quarter coming online.
Well, we are one of 16 municipalities in the county, and surely there will be lots of demand. So I think I understand that we may not be able to guarantee a specific amount, but it's also not very comforting that we just are ensured some commitment without any kind of detail.
One thing I think will help us with that is that UTA is launching a core route study, and we already know from some of the prior work, 5-year service plans and such, that the routes that go outside of Salt Lake City that are also extremely important within the city, we have a ton of overlap with UTA plans, and so I think that will help drive those investments. Really, the strong routes here are strong routes all over the place.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, that's true. And then another example would be that as we expand bus service, there will be a need for additional transit hubs. So like an East Downtown transit hub and a transit hub near North Temple and Redwood Road in order to accommodate the increased number of, just the layover and the transfers, places for, breaks for the bus operators. So we'll be working closely with UTA on those. Those are things that clearly benefit us, but that have a regional service as well. So the third point is Salt Lake City and UTA wish to enable people and businesses to rely on transit. So we do that through encouraging permanence and stability. So that's a commitment from both the city and from UTA that through capital investments, and then also just a stated commitment that we're not going to be moving these routes around. We want people to be able to rely on them and build their lifestyle around them. We talked a lot about that in the spring. The next point was Salt Lake City and UTA recognize the value of an enduring process for decision making that stands the test of time. So part of that is establishing a methodology that can be updated and applied far into the future. So as we've been having these discussions, we've been saying, 10, 20 years from now, we want the annual addendum to this agreement to be a very no drama exercise that you can swap out people and players and personalities, and it just makes so much sense that you just keep doing it. So that's our goal. So part of that is simplicity, and also just setting up in a way that feels very fair and financially and sustainable in every other way for both Salt Lake City and UTA. Then the last point is Salt Lake City and UTA are implementing a plan driven by data analysis and public engagement. Transparency and accountability should shape the execution of the program. It's very critical that we're transparent with each other and with the public. So we're talking about shared dashboards with data that is updated as regularly as possible, that's fed up into some sort of dashboard that we can regularly access.
That the public can access? Okay. Or
yes, everyone. Yes.
Okay. Great. Questions, council members? Well, we appreciate the very collaborative and quick work that's happening. And that I missed the beginning when I had to step out, but I'm sure Russell touched on the time sensitivity for us in getting these agreements in place before we start receiving sales tax dollars, which we're committed to investing in this. So with that, council members, anything else? Great. Thank you to our friends at UTA and everyone in hand who has been helping on this project.
Thank you.
We look forward to more updates.
There will be plenty.
Great.
Thank you.
Okay, with that, we're now back on track and we're a little bit early for our Housing Gap Coalition Affordability presentation by Bryn Mortensen and Abby Osborne. Thank you for being early.
Glad it worked out.
Are you Bryn or Abby?
I'm Bryn, and
Okay.
Abby is unable to attend, so I'm here.
Oh,
for
okay.
both of us.
So our earliness isn't hurting her.
No, we're
Great.
great.
Bryn, will you just bring that microphone right up? Because even if
Yes.
we can hear you, our TV viewers at home want to listen to what you have to say. And thank you for sharing the presentation with us. It sounds like you're making this presentation often.
Yes, a couple times a week. We're trying to get to as many of the cities across the Wasatch Front and Tooele County and Washington County by the end of the year. So
That's an aggressive project to
it
undertake.
is. It's been great, though.
And council members, of course, this is in your electronic packet, but I think it's also in your paper packet.
We're going to run through a condensed version of what we sent over as well, so we don't take up as much of your time. So just to kind of clarify, but as I'm sure most of you know, we, as the Salt Lake Chamber, actually run the state chamber organization. So all 74 local chambers run up through us. We have members in all 29 counties and represent over 12,000 businesses. So about a year and a half ago, we had business leaders coming to us and saying our employees are having a hard time with housing, both recruiting new employees, but just their current employees trying to, sorry, I don't know what's happening, trying to.
Not you.
Okay. Either trying to have that new next step in the housing market or just getting into the housing market. And so we talked with Natalie Gochner, who's our chief economist and also runs the Gardner Policy Institute up at the U. And she said, you know what, we need to do a deep dive into this. And so they took about 8 months and looked back a generation, which is considered 26 years, at our current generation, and then projected forward a generation at the housing market. And Natalie coins this as a landmark study on housing. It's the first study of its kind that looks into a housing crisis before it happens, as we're trying to not become the Bay Area and Seattle. So what we found in this study is that for the first time in 40 years, we have more households or household formations, whatever that looks like to you, than housing units. And that gap right now is about 54,000. And so this is really going to be our greatest economic threat. And so what we found is that we're ranked 4th in the nation for housing price increases. And at this rate, if you take a $125,000 home in Utah in 1991, that home now costs $347,000. Where at the national growth rate, that would only cost $184,000. And so we're already, the Salt Lake metro area and the Orem-Provo metro area are already 20% higher than our competitive, those that we compete against, like Phoenix and Las Vegas. We found that the average price of a home, and this is the conservative number in the report, will be more than $700,000 in the next 26 years if unaddressed. We also found that the average, not average, but the first year teacher, both in the Salt Lake Valley and Nebo school district, so Utah County, can afford 1% of the housing market. And after teaching 10 years, they can only afford 16%. So our fear is that we're pricing out our teachers, our nurses, our policemen and women, those that we need in our community. So the report tells us that there's a few reasons that these prices are going up. One, the housing shortage that we talked about. Two, construction and labor costs. We have the lowest construction labor in our state's history. And then with the rebuilding of the airport, we're having to attract talent from outside of the state just for that project. So we don't have enough construction to fill the needs for these housing. Land and topography, we can only grow so far. In 1991, we had the same issue of housing shortage, but we could just continue to sprawl. And we've run out of that luxury because we're pushed up against the mountains and up against the lakes. Local zoning and NIMBYism, the not in my backyard. Cam Deal, we're working hand in hand with the League of Cities and Towns, and he says this is an issue that the business community and local governments are kind of ahead of, and the general public is behind. So trying to get them caught up so that elected officials can zone and do the things that they need to do to address these problems without fear of referendum or pushback. And then we are leading the nation in economic and population growth, which is great. It's 2/3 of that population growth is internal, but it's putting that constraint on the supply and demand. So what we did is we launched the Housing Gap Coalition, and that's chaired by Steve Starks, the president of Utah Jazz, and Larry H. Miller, Sports and Entertainment, as well as Clint Betts from Silicon Slopes. And we found some possible solutions, working with Wasatch Front Regional Council on the Transportation Land Use Connections Program, the TLC, having them help align your transportation and density and housing, because we're not here to say density needs to go everywhere, this is what we need you to do. We recognize that each community is unique and needs to maintain that. Salt Lake City, you are doing a great job at putting density where it makes sense. To address the construction labor issue, we are partnering with the Ken Garff Foundation to create a Build to Success program similar to the Code to Success. A journeyman plumber is making 6 figures, and these are great jobs, and it's really to get into the high school and teach these students that these are great lucrative careers that they can go into, and hopefully address that construction shortage. We've partnered with the League of Cities and Towns, Wasatch Front Regional WFRC, and the Counties Association to do a public awareness campaign. We're working with Y2 Analytics, who's doing a series of interviews and a survey to really get the public sentiment about growth, because we don't necessarily believe that it's they're anti an apartment going up next to them. Part of it's that, but part of it's the feeling of congestion and that growth. And so if we can learn to know what they're feeling, we can launch this public awareness campaign to hopefully try to change the hearts and minds, so that as elected officials you can govern and make those decisions of how you want your community to look without public pushback. So as I was saying, we're visiting as much of every city across the Wasatch Front as possible, asking to look over your general plans and update moderate income plans, which thank you for being one of the very few cities that is compliant with your moderate income plan. We have cities that haven't done that since 2003, so thank you. We're also just asking to look at zoning overview, how you can reutilize old commercial spaces or business parks and bring new life to it through multi-use, or just really planning ahead for this population growth that is coming, and how we can all work together on a regional basis to accommodate it. But now my question for you is, what are you feeling? How can the coalition help you? What are you doing? Just kind of have that dialogue.
Great, thanks, Bren. Council members, do you have questions? Councilmember Johnston, I know you do.
Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
I know that this is a condensed version. The full one is targeted towards local elected officials, essentially. And it's zoning for why your policy recommendations are look at your zoning, look at your fees, and support multi-use land development. Is there a discussion about the offset of saying lower your fees and then city's ability to do anything else, say zoning or any of those kind of changes?
So what we recognize is that the land that's left to develop is definitely not the best. The best land was not saved for last. So we recognize that some of these developments will cost more as you try to plan your infrastructure, your water, all of that. And so it's not necessarily, we're not going out and saying everyone needs to lower their fees, this is what we need you to do. Just making sure some cities have an overarching, this is the fee no matter what the impact is on the community. So just being sure that you're fair. Our biggest ask is just to proactively plan and to look at all of these aspects as you're planning. So I'm sorry, did that answer
Sure.
your question?
Well, I
or-
bring it up because our planning department, I think, has 20 planners in it.
Okay.
And we can't touch the need. Well, we touch the need. We're not quite, I mean, we struggled to keep up on our work from the city. And we're Salt Lake City. We're huge compared to other cities, right?
Correct.
I can't imagine there's a city in the state that has enough resources to do the massive amount of zoning and planning work that's going to require for some of this stuff. So that's the sort of predicament that a lot of cities run into. Lower your fees for the developers who say that's a problem, but then get done with everything quicker. Finish my application quicker, do my permitting quicker, all those kind of things. And so I would request sort of that discussion to move forward a little bit as well. You're putting some cities in a real dilemma. I can't do both of these.
Right.
The second thing is there an update? I got three things. Second thing is there's an update on your public awareness campaign.
So,
the one we saw felt a little claustrophobic.
yes, the teeny house.
Yeah.
That got the X
Okay.
on that. So we're not going forward with that. That's after that meeting, we partnered with Y2 Analytics. They're running their focus groups right now, I think until the end of next week. And we should have that data by the first week of September, ready to launch second week of September based on that information. So it's still in the process, but yeah, the claustrophobic teeny house we decided was not the route we wanted
Thank
to go.
The last thing, and you don't have to answer this, I'm going to put it out there as a question maybe you can
Okay.
take back.
Absolutely.
I've been to the Chamber of Commerce meetings on this, and I have heard one person brought up wage stagnation. And I was hoping the Chamber of Commerce would at least say something about it. Housing prices have escalated much quicker than anything else. I get that. But wages have not escalated in any way, even in a tight labor market. And I'd love to hear at least some acknowledgement of that back or some discussion of that piece.
Okay.
Otherwise, we're on it's a losing trajectory for all of us. We can't possibly pay for housing, medical needs, insurance, whatever it is, the transportation at the same time if wages are not keeping up.
Right.
And so, like I said, you don't have to have an answer today, but that's been a sort of this donut hole in this discussion, especially from the Chamber of Commerce. So.
Okay. No, I will happily bring that back. Thank you.
Building on that, what does the Gardner policy report, the white paper, what does it say on wages? Does it even mention wages?
It mentions that our housing prices are growing 2 times faster than our wages, and that it doesn't go into the wages as much. And I have copies I can leave here for you as well.
I would love a copy, actually.
Wonderful.
Okay, that's too bad. Thanks.
You're welcome.
I'd say a second to Councilmember Johnston's comments. In particular, Salt Lake City, we do waive impact fees for affordable housing projects, and the permitting fees are cost justified fees, as he was saying. Those are not, you said that you asked cities to be fair. That's a cost justification process that really isn't about profit. It's about covering the expense of having individuals sit at a permitting counter and review applications and things. So I think it feels like there's a bit of conflation between the need for housing and the need for affordable housing, because we do make an incredible amount of financial commitment. This body has made an incredible financial commitment to affordable housing, particularly in the last year and a half or 2 years. And we have a rate, according to James Wood's work at the Policy Institute, at 4 times the next municipality in terms of multifamily home development here in Salt Lake City. So I think my concern is that as this Housing Gap Coalition is an iteration out of the Chamber, which has an incredible business presence, that there may be legislation yet to come that asks cities to, or requires cities to, lose our cost-justified reimbursement for the real costs it takes a city to process applications, and undercut all other forms of business, therefore, that have to come through that same permitting line, because we don't have enough people to pay to take care of permitting process. So I'm afraid if we support housing development, even non-affordable housing development, we end up harming all other forms of business in our economy who need to go through those same processes. So I didn't, in the longer presentation, nor in the pack and the paper, the white paper, which I have had a chance to read when it was presented a few months ago, I don't remember it going into that kind of analysis. If we pull this thread here, certainly there's a tug somewhere else in the ecosystem of any city.
Right.
So it's a long way to say, if you get to a point of approaching legislative conversations, please dig deeper into where these adjustments end up harming municipal economies and the statewide economy, and perhaps not necessarily creating more affordable housing, just more housing.
And Madam Chair, it's an important piece that this is a housing gap, and so usually that's being conflated as housing affordability, above 40% AMI sort of total, but that has almost nothing to do with affordable housing below 40% AMI. And some of the discussions have been that if we did some of these things, recommendations such as we decrease some building costs, we decrease the overhead from fees and things from cities, we did some things like this, it would help affordable housing. I don't think there's any basis to believe that, though. I think it would help housing, period, in the total stock, and maybe that helps long-term and years to come for a lot of reasons. I agree with that. But it doesn't do anything for affordable housing because the subsidy required far outstrips anything you're going to get cost things that way. And so very different populations that way. I know some people are clear about this, but a lot of discussions seem to be conflating them and thinking that if we did these kind of things to decrease some of the overhead costs of building a building, it would actually create affordable housing. It doesn't match that gap. So.
Great, thank you. On your point on legislation, that's why we want to be here and meet with cities, is because we want to work together to address that. I don't know, I guess what California is always in session, but they passed SB 35, which takes all land use authority away from local governments, and that is a point that we're not advocating for. That's why we're hoping to partner with cities and work together and find solutions to keep each city unique and to allow cities to govern how they want to look. And so that's our biggest proponent and reason for getting out.
Thank you. We appreciate that very much. Council members, anything else before we let Bryn go home and have dinner? And council members in a minute. Okay, thank you very much for being with us. And that takes us to our last agenda item. Council members, I have to say I'm sorry that we've gone so long without a break. Charlie, everybody else, please take a break if you need one. I'm sorry. We had that time-sensitive one, and then, so let's get this done. Small cell wireless facilities follow-up. Item 6, Kira Luke from our council office. Thank you for being with us. I know Kimberly Chitros from the attorney's office is here. Dan Rip, our real property manager, and Melissa Jensen from Housing and Neighborhood Development. And we had an email yesterday from Ben Ludke in council office that I'm not sure our packets are updated, but it had the design guidelines. Does everyone have that? Okay, then let's give council members just a second to, let me see if anyone
The design
can chime
guidelines in the packet should be the most recent ones that we've received.
The paper packet or the electronic packet?
The electronic packet. Your paper packet should have the presentation that you're going to see in a few moments.
Mine says it was updated 5 days ago, so.
That sounds, the email that you got yesterday should have been the presentation.
And that's what you want us to look at, right? Or was there a more robust?
So let me orient us real quickly, and I think we'll get to there. So this is the second briefing. The council is scheduled to have a second public hearing and consider voting on this evening. The council chose to have a second public hearing because we hadn't seen the design guidelines at the time of the last public hearing. We received a draft copy of the most up-to-date design guidelines in time for packets last Thursday, so that should be the most recent copy that we've been provided. Those have also been sent out in some email updates. There's been an invitation to review
So there's the, yeah, some of you've got it out, the black paper packet. Yep. Okay.
There have also been some updates to the ordinance since the last briefing. The red line version is also in your electronic packet that mostly incorporates feedback from the council members, the last briefing, and feedback from providers as well. And I think other than that, there's a policy question at the top of the staff report for the council to bear in mind during the presentation of whether they would prefer to formally adopt the design guidelines or defer that to the administration to update and maintain. And then with that, I'll turn it over to Dan and Melissa to present on the design guidelines and orient you to the work that they've done so far.
Thanks, Kira.
Thanks, Kira. So we will be brief so that you can go and have some dinner too. Thanks for
We're ahead of schedule,
taking some time
but
and
thank you.
last the best of all the game, I guess, right? Be on last of the agenda. But I just wanted to take a few minutes and just do a really high-level review of our small cell design guideline, or excuse me, design standard that we have prepared, and just give you some, some idea of what that is and what the guidelines are going to look like. And if there are any details that you want to know, please feel free to stop me anytime and ask those questions. So our main goal for the manual is to maintain this existing city aesthetic. So we wrote this with that in mind, not wanting to make any kind of changes, but really just preserve the look that we already have. The design standard manual was a really complex process because it was a very complex concept, and we put together a team made up of professionals from the city who are experts in those technical fields, and each of them took their respective area of expertise and wrote around that for us, and then they submitted it to us. The version that you received last Thursday has actually evolved since then, as it's constantly being refined. So we see this as being a living document that's going to have many future revisions, just because as we go, we're going to learn along the way, and we're probably going to have to make some changes as we go. So it's organized in a very general, with a general table at the beginning, and then as you go through the manual, it gets very specific, as there is one chapter for each type of attachment. And in each chapter, we get into the real specific technical things that are components to those attachments. And then finally, at the back of the manual, there is technical specifications that get into the details of color and material and all of the other things that are necessary for to preserve the aesthetic. There are 5 different attachment types: utility poles, street lights, monopoles, traffic signals, and kiosk and street signs. And I'm just going to go through each one really quickly. First one is the utility poles. Our preference is for the antenna to be located on the top of the pole, and I tried to get some pictures that would best represent this for us. But if you can see on this one, at the very top, it's really hard to see the delineation between the pole and what's called the cantenna. So the antenna is actually housed inside a can-looking structure, hence the cantenna.
Not a cantina.
On a cantina, yes.
Like a super fund site, not a super fun site.
Right, exactly.
Sorry, it's getting late. We need to eat.
What we're trying to avoid is any type of attachment to the side of the pole that would extend to the side. And most pole owners do not allow for any meters to be attached to the poles, so we're going to have to manage meters and utility boxes in the right-of-way with the utility pole attachments. Next are street lights. There are going to be certain street lights that are going to be easier to attach to. We've identified these type of lights that we feel like are going to be the most cost-effective and the easiest for providers to attach to. These are the ones that have the Cobra arms at the top. And we anticipate cantennas to be placed at the top of the pole. We know that lights that are owned and operated by Salt Lake City Public Utilities will need to be open for attachments. Lights in residential neighborhoods that are owned by the residents are off limits because they're not owned by the city. Lights that are in enhanced service areas will have some extra requirements. We don't allow for any diminished lighting services, so you couldn't take one of our cactus poles, for instance, and remove one of the lights and replace it with an antenna, and that's so that we don't diminish the lighting. And we also would require that any type of replacement or any type of attachment would probably require a replacement with an exact replica of the pole, which would require that all equipment would be placed on the inside and be self-contained. And this type, this would be a very, very costly venture for a provider to have to provide. Next is the monopoles. And the overall goal is to make sure that the monopole matches the surrounding aesthetics and that they become self-contained.
This one match or not match?
So
Because I
this would
see a
be-
really attractive light next to it.
This would be an example of one that's not in our city, but that would probably not match. So if you look at South Temple down right in front of the Joseph Smith building, UTA did a really good job with putting their electrical poles to run the tracks that match all of our decorative light poles. So they're black, they're fluted, and you'll see those that are lining the right-of-way there. Imagine that as a sort of monopole that we would require in our right-of-way to match the surrounding poles. So we would want those monopoles to be the same color, the same texture. So if it's a fluted pole, we would require that and the same material as our light poles. That's not an excellent example picture. I apologize.
Well, it's an example of what we wouldn't want.
What we wouldn't do. Yes, thank you.
Councilmember Johnston?
And can you help me understand where we would need a monopole versus something attached to existing light or a new light?
So what we'd probably want to do is, if an attachment to a light pole is available and it's something that can be done, we would want to do that. But in a situation where we would not want them to attach to a decorative light pole, then we would want to probably have a monopole instead.
That would be better than attaching to a light? Even if it
And
was
again,
structured?
depending on the light. So if it's a light like,
Here's my question. Go back to that previous one. We are 2 back, I guess, now. Yeah. Theoretically, if they're the same color, the same sort of idea, they match. But would have been better to have it on the light pole that's sitting there versus a monopole 10 feet away. That's sort of my question, I guess.
Right.
Sort of when we make the decision process, it's beholder about, do you compromise a decorative pole, but does it compromise it by having it next door anyway? So.
and it may, and I think we have to look at those on a case-by-case basis. But if it doesn't make sense to have one 10 feet away, and it can be attached to the light pole or the decorative light pole, then we certainly would move in the direction of doing that. Okay, and then next are traffic signals, and really the main emphasis on this is that we don't want to compromise the structural integrity of the existing traffic signal, and there won't be any attachments allowed on the mast arm so that we don't have any distractions to drivers. And we do not allow radios or meters to be attached to the poles. So this is another situation where we're going to have to manage utility boxes in the right-of-way next to the poles. And then finally, we have our kiosks and other attachments. I think this is going to be a really effective tool that we have, especially along Main Street. And here's a picture of one that a provider provided for the city of San Francisco, where everything is self-contained inside the kiosk. And I think it may be even an opportunity for the city to see some upgrades to our kiosks along Main Street. The equipment that you're going to see around the city is going to consist of an antenna. And as you saw in some of the pictures, the cantana is the can or the shrouding that goes around the actual antenna. There's going to be conduit that runs underneath the sidewalks and in the right-of-way that's going to send fiber to the antennas. There's going to be a meter and a power box, as well as a radio box attached to the poles where they're allowed, and in other instances, they'll be in the right-of-way. So our timeline is that after tonight in our extended public hearing, as City Council moves to adopt the small cell ordinance, we would be moving forward to completing the design standard manual and have that available by the end of August. And then we would begin our public outreach strategy by distributing information to the public as to what's coming. There's going to be some construction noticing as required in their building permits, and we anticipate issuing permits beginning on September 1st.
Ooh.
So I think we're really close to the finish line.
Okay, council members. Questions? I want to say that I think Dan and Kimberly, you've done an incredible job. I really feel like you get our concerns here and then have a much better understanding of the statute landscape than we've been able to receive in the briefings we've had. So I'm comfortable with us moving ahead personally. I'm comfortable with us moving ahead with this tonight to see that you're going to be completing the manual by the end of August. That's, 12 days away. So it's a lot of work you've taken on in a short amount of time.
Thank you.
Any comments, questions, council members? Dinner time, okay. Well,
Just as
thank you.
a point of functionality too, when we do get the most updated version, we'll be sure just to pass that along so you have the most recent, because you'll notice that we'll continue to refine it, and so always
Thank you.
open for that as well.
Thank you, Melissa. We're set to hold another public hearing and accept comment tonight, and then we have the option to take action tonight as well. Is that right? We are holding? Yes. Okay.
Yes. Just to Kira's question at the beginning of the briefing, is the council okay with the administration having this as sort of a living document that's not each time it's updated, adopted by ordinance, or does the council want to adopt it each time by ordinance?
Can I take that as a straw poll? Everybody who's in favor of the living document scenario that doesn't need to come back to the council for changes, give me a thumbs up. Or discussion. Any discussion? Okay. All right, that's unanimous with Councilmember Rogers absent. Great.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now we have a couple of quick announcements for our executive director report.
The first is the council will remember that the council appropriated some money to the council office budget for a legislative lobbyist. If the council members have any suggestions about names to put on a potential list for candidates, please send them to council staff so that we can start compiling that. Council staff, so me right now, but Cindy when she's back. So just let me know, and then we'll have a list together, and then we can review it all together. Is that okay? Okay.
Great, thanks.
Then the next is the Utah League of Cities and Towns is asking for anyone who's interested in serving on the nominations committee to be on the Utah League of Cities and Towns Board of Directors. Councilmember Johnston has volunteered that he could serve on that committee, but we wanted to run it by the board, or run it by the full council. So if the council's okay with us forwarding Councilmember Johnston's name,
Thank
staff will do
you.
that. Okay. That's it.
Okay, we don't have any chair, vice chair report unless something came up. So with that, we'll conclude and have dinner and be across the hall at 7 o'clock.